Hybr?
Thanks very much for having me. So my name's Hannah and I'm the CEO and founder of Hybr. We are a marketplace of first-time renters. So we're really tailor-made for both students and young graduates. We aggregate all available homes for young people in one place, making sure that their hands are held and they have a very supportive rental journey as they match the right home. And for our landlords, our property owners, we accelerate lease up. So we market, qualify, and onboard great tenants to their properties to accelerate lease up and automate void management. So that's really the marketplace in one.
Awesome. And can you just give us an overview of your fundraising today?
Of course. So in 2022, beginning 2022, raised just under £1 million pre-seed round. And then at the end of last year, we closed a 3.3 million seed round.
And what was the breakdown of like friends and family money, angel money, VC across those two?
So the pre-seed round was 100% angel investors. Mostly was originally kind of pitched to the landlords. So the landlords who understood the proposition and could really open doors from a scaling supply perspective, where a marketplace always be supply constrained. So really important to get buy-in from landlords themselves. And the rest of them were strategic angel investors. And then our seed rounds, we had two lead investors, one VC, kind of a pan-European fintech VC, and the other one was an angel syndicate based in the UK with a lot of property, real estate professionals within their syndicates, which can be very relevant.
Yeah, nice. And in terms of that, kind of going back to the first fundraise, so for a bit of context, the majority of founders here are raising their pre-seed round. What was your initial approach to how you were going to raise money from angel investors? Did you know any of them, or did you go in completely cold? And when you kind of sat down and thought about the strategy for how you were going to win over angel investors, how close was what happened in reality to what happened in your strategy?
So I'd say that there was no strategy when I first began. It was very scattergun approach, which meant I was just doing about 5 different meetings a day and trying to build a network. Because to answer your first question, I did go in cold. I didn't really have that network there, and I didn't choose to go down the kind of family friends route, particularly to begin with. So I used LinkedIn, Octopus. There's a few other kind of channels like that where you can automate outreach. So I bucketed our investors into, for me, it was targeting marketplace investors, prop tech investors, and investors that invested in female, so female focused investors. And I had a tailor-made introduction that felt, organic and targeted to those 3 different types of buckets. And that was what I kind of sent out to get those first meetings booked in. And that allowed me, even in our pre-seed, I gave myself a month and I said, I'm going to speak to 30 VCs in a month. And by the end of that first month, if I don't feel like it's going to happen with a VC, then I'm going to stop that. But I still really enjoyed that exercise. I think it was really useful because it built my profile within that space. And also, even the VCs who said you're too early, they introduced me to their angel investor network. And then once I met one high net worth individual in London, they then introduced me to 2 more and 2 more and 2 more. So that was such an important part of the process to go in to open myself up to the market. So that was one point. So cold outreach on LinkedIn, going to events is so useful. So I did a NatWest pitching competition. I did the Albright network, that's again female focused, pitching competition. I did a We Can Capital, was an event at the Google office. I did a lot of different competitions. I can't quite remember them all now, but I can send a list after. And I basically just looked up pitching competitions for pre-seed, because that firstly is great practice. You're on stage, you're pitching a business model, you're getting it torn to shreds, you're getting challenged, which can help prepare you for when you're on those more difficult VC conversations. But also, again, people who were listening would come up and introduce me to 2 people that they knew, or they would say that they were an angel investor themselves. So really putting myself out there. And then bringing on advisors, so targeting a few people to be advisors, giving them equity for, let's say, 2 to 4 hours a month, who were either, for me, that was mostly focusing on marketplace experts, people who'd built marketplaces, scaled out marketplaces, a very specific model, who were then very well connected within the angel space that could then open more doors for me.
Awesome. Two questions on the cold outreach that I know founders will want to know. Number one, in terms of funnel, like how many messages would you say that you sent on LinkedIn cold versus how many people responded versus how many people kind of took the initial call, just so founders have an idea of like the breadth of contact that they're going to have to make. And then I'll ask the next question after.
So I had like a 35% acceptance rate, which was pretty good, and was really A/B testing the different copy in terms of that introduction and bucketing the different kind of target VCs or angel investors. And then in terms of, I can't remember the exact numbers, but I'd say that 10% I would book in meetings with after that first initial invite. I have to say though that I didn't do that full time. That was more at the end of the raise when I was just trying to find the final investors to kind of complete the rounds. But another really important part of the strategy was before I officially started the pre-seed and same with the seed rounds, I started the networking. I got the kind of commitments, the verbal commitments of, let's say, 35% of the round, so that when I officially started the raise, I said, oh, we've already got 40% complete. We're only looking for that final 60%. So that really helped the first conversations because no one likes to be the first investor. So by going in and saying, oh, it's right, even on my first meeting saying, oh, I'm close to closing, really helped create that momentum that's really needed.
There's a lot of people that really desperately want to get a lead investor because then they think the other investors or smaller checks are going to follow. So how did you deal with that, the lead investor thing?
I think that's such a rabbit hole. I was obsessed with the lead investor, and actually both on our seed round, we raised, so I went out to raise 1.5 million and we got to 3 million without it, or 3 million without a lead investor. And then the lead investor came in for that final 300K. And it was really, I don't even think I really needed that. And same with the pre-seed round, we had no lead investor. And so I think sometimes the fixation with having a lead investor can lead you down the wrong track. And it's just about getting lots of strategic angel investors on board, especially for the pre-seed, that can open doors. And I think if I would do it again, I'd have a much clearer strategy over what is our biggest bottlenecks as a business. For us, it would be the supply constraints, so people can open doors to landlords, demand generation, people who are growth experts, and funnel optimization, custom funnels, people who understand marketplace models. And I would have just really targeted those three people to then work backwards for where we want to be by our seed round to get the right people around me. I think that's a better way of going than thinking about the perfect lead investor.
A lot of I guess conversation that you might hear in the investment landscape is that the reason why other investors want a lead is because they want someone to take the lead on doing the due diligence. So if you have loads of kind of smaller ticket investors without a lead, how did you make it easier for all of them to do DD in the kind of the simplest way that would make them say yes faster?
I also, rather than going down the seed legals route, I thought I got a matched quote. So we paid the same amount of money to go down with Sheridan's, they're a law firm. And I'd much rather that because I think that's the one point where you really want to have those personal relationships with someone you can pick up the phone to and ask questions and understand that process. It's super important. So we just had good lawyers that put together the term sheets that helped communicate to our investors. That meant that, and a really in-depth data room. Like I used Notion. I had a really great data room for both pre-seed and the seed round that had all our investor FAQs, every question that I could predict they would ever ask us in one place. So that was the due diligence, and then good lawyers to make sure that we had all the right documentation in place.
The question that I was going to ask earlier, I know you said this was for the end of your round, but regarding cold outreach on LinkedIn, obviously not every investor will put that they're an investor in their bio on LinkedIn. So how would you identify who you thought might be investor if they didn't have it kind of clearly displayed in their bio?
There are a lot of great lists out there. There are a lot of publications over the best 100 angel investors in the UK, and those lists become very targeted. So if whatever industry you're in, you can target those lists and then you can download them, cross-reference against LinkedIn, and then you can target in that way.
There's also another hack that we tell founders, and this is also really useful, especially if you're a female founder wanting to raise from angels that invest in founders. But if you go to a LinkedIn company page for like Alma Angels, for example, which is an angel group, if you go to their employees, the people listed are not actually employees, they're angel investors that are investing with that community. And then you can have a look at them and see what industry they work in and that kind of stuff. And it's a good way to get a list of active angel investors that you know are interested, if you're a female founder and female founders, but also Angel Investment Network and a few other communities and syndicates have their listed as employees. So there's different hacks.
You can also have scouts for and they do have the word scout on their profiles for big VCs, that there's a way of kind of cheating the system to get a VC ticket, and you can use one of the big we've got investment from X, but it's actually part of their scout program. So the biggest European VCs will have scout programs where they'll very quickly be able to write 100k checks, 50 to 200k checks through the scout program. You then can have that brand recognition of staying back, which really helps bring on more high net worth and angel investors, and then gets a foot in the door for those bigger VCs when it comes to the next round.
Yeah. Also with your outreach, I know you said you were A/B testing and it's quite specific to the industry that you're in or who you were targeting, but were you just sending connection requests with a message, or were you doing, I know this is very specific, but were you like a premium LinkedIn member and you were sending emails? What were you finding was working?
So found that rather than doing I wasn't using premium LinkedIn, so I was just using normal LinkedIn, and it was very much just tailored for each investor. So I would say, this is who I am, this is what I've achieved, in like a really very few words, minimal words. And then I'd love to get your advice on raising a pre-seed or whatever it was, or this your particular company that you work in that you scaled. I'd love to speak to you about your experience, given that I'm doing this in this journey. And I think by adding in a quick metric that shows that you're serious, for example, we just got to break even in the first 6 months, it makes them interested and to know what you're doing. So just hitting them with something that makes you stand out from the rest, and then asking for advice, because in the classic thing, ask for advice, get money, ask for money, get advice.
That's interesting that worked. Okay, so in terms of metrics, you kind of touched on it just then. You would put in one thing that makes you stand out. What metrics were you measuring at pre-seed, and then how were you demonstrating that growth to investors? And I guess, how important do you think that metric side of the storytelling was important in them getting them to write a check versus like the team or the market opportunity or a different part of the pitch?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think for us, well, I think for everyone at pre-seed, it's really all around the storytelling aspect. It's about storytelling and telling a story in a way that's really relatable and that people will buy into, and especially rooting that in your own personal experience. So for me, my story was all around, I was a student at the University of Bristol. I graduated. I could have gone down the kind of consulting route, but became fixated with a problem that I'd gone through, told that personal element, and then linked that into, so built the platform from scratch, did everything that don't scale to really test the concept, and then kind of building it from there. And I think from the early days, showing that we really hacked growth. So we used Facebook groups to grow, and we got to 150 users, and we were cold calling to win our first clients, and just showing that you'll do anything to grow the business and that you're hacky and you're thinking outside the box really was the kind of, I think, what helped us raise that pre-seed round. So yeah, I think the story around how you get your early adopters, those super fan users, and making sure that they love the product, so that when they do reference calls, I mean, they didn't actually do any reference calls in the pre-seed, but when they can see the kind of case studies of why they love the experience, then that's all there. So yeah, hacking growth is the most important one. A loved product is a second, because it's all about showing that even when you've got a very scrappy product, that the users absolutely are bought in and that you're solving a real problem, was like the second most important. And then kind of a route to market, so that you've kind of already understood how you're going to be able to grow for us, the supply and the demand side, so that once you've got cash in, you know how you can copy and paste that, and it's tried and tested route to market. because even at the pre-seed round, they wanted to see that the investment was de-risked. That you've already validated that you've got buy-in, so you've got people ready to sign contracts with you, or you've already got people using whatever very basic product is live, and that you know how to grow that. So you've already got the 3 marketing channels, whether that's Twitter, TikTok, and Facebook groups, or whatever works for your market. So I think it's really, but what worked well for us is I had been fixated on Bristol, proving the concept in 2 boroughs, you might say, in specific locations within Bristol. And even by generating, we're talking about 15 bookings a month, that was break even because we had no costs. So it really wasn't break even, but that showed that we were focused on the right metrics. We were focused on delivering a great experience, and they could see that if they put cash in, injected cash, we could actually scale this.
How did you work out pricing, and did you play around with it that much, or did you involve your customers in those conversations?
Involve customers, and I think for us it was all about, we didn't want to be the cheapest, and also investors are always scared of products that are just going as the USP as being the cheapest product out there, because someone can always be cheaper. So not the cheapest, but also cost efficient, because allowing be able to win on savings, because you're going to eventually fuel this with tech and replace manual outdated processes to allow you to be cheaper than the rest. So I think that was like the fine balance, and also again validating it on such a small scale, but still having the case studies that people will pay for the products and have paid for the products.
That makes sense. We've got another few questions, so if you do have a question for Hannah, either raise your hand using the emoji reaction hand raise and we can get round to it, or put a question in the chat and we can ask it ourselves. You were overfunded, so you raised like over $1 million more than you were originally intending to, is that right?
Yeah, so for the again though, I think that's an important part of the tactic, is same for pre-seed. We set out to raise 250k, then we pushed up to 500k, and then we ended up raising 975k. But it's always important to have that storytelling aspect over, we've got a business model that allows us to get where we want to go with a much smaller fraction of what we actually want. So you can show that model, and then you can quite easily hit that first target, and then you're a oversubscribed round and people are interested in what you're doing, because they can say, okay, you can hit this where the metrics you should be to get a good seed round with less money, then let's give you more money and we de-risk the chance of you getting there.
If you don't mind sharing, what was the valuation that you were raising at? And then in terms of being overfunded, did that impact, I mean, it obviously did impact how much equity you're giving away to investors, but were you comfortable with kind of giving away more equity in order to have more runway?
Definitely. So our pre-seed we raised at a 3 million pre-money, and then our seed round we raised at a 6 million pre-money a year later. And it was important for us. I think it's important just to not die on the hill of the valuation. Strategic, smart capital is so much more important than pushing to get the best valuation. And it is very much just about working out how many rounds you want to be, where do you need to go to grow, working backwards, and then testing the waters, throwing a valuation out there in a call that you don't mind as much about, seeing how they respond, testing that out with a few different people, and then kind of being quite committed to your valuation. Because people will tell you in the same day that your valuation is way too high and your valuation is way too low. There is no right valuation, so you're just going to have to find something that feels right and stick with it. I think, yeah.
On Friday, we're going to go over some of the kind of averages with valuations pulled from Seed Legal's data, so founders here can have an idea what they might be benchmarked against if they're speaking to different investors. If you had to share like 2 learnings that were the most crucial that you think founders here could just save a bunch of time if they knew this up front, or could be really useful to them based on your fundraising experience, what would it be?
I think I wasted a lot of time with the scattergun approach. I really spoke to everyone. I didn't have a clear enough strategy going into it, and thinking I have a limited amount of time. Who should I be targeting here? Who I think can add the most value, and really understanding what value they can add and why them. So I think I would have spent much more time doing that. I also went in and had like my first calls with the best VCs, which you should never do. So also making sure that you're doing a practice round with people that you don't care as much about is super important. But I think there's like three key lessons. Is firstly, especially in raising a pre-seed, putting yourself out there, getting involved in every event where you might be able to meet investors, pitching competitions, is so important to build that network and speak passionately about what you're doing, and people will want to introduce you to their network, and not being too, people who are too pushy and just ask directly, can you introduce me? You don't want to do that. But if you show that you are just passionate and you want to meet people to learn and gain from their experiences, then they're going to want to help you. So putting yourself out there in the right way. The second thing I'd say is being obsessed with storytelling. So really understand like your own personal anecdotes and your own personal experience, and rooting the story in that, and then making sure it's really relatable, and you're building each part as a story. And the best storytellers are the best pitchers, and you get people to buy in within a 30-minute call, and you can tell immediately as they shift and they lean forward and they ask more and more questions. So the power of storytelling. And the last one is just show that you are hustling and you're hacking away to whether you can break even. And again, you might literally be spending £500 a month on marketing. So you need to spend £500 to get £500 of revenue. And if you decide to sell your clothes on Depop to do that, then that's still break even. Just showing that you will do anything and that you're hustling and hacking away to growth within the early days, so that you actually have data to show when you're going out to pitch, versus just saying like this is the idea, is so important. Not enough people do that. It's what I was regularly told. So yeah, showing that you can hustle and hack your way to those initial growth metrics.
Yeah. And when we've spoken to investors, like everyone's looking at what metrics you might have, but investors are also interested in speed of learning. So not only speed of execution and how you're hacking your way to growth, but if you found that something doesn't work, how did you find that it didn't work? How did you respond to that? What are you doing next? So even if you don't have revenue yet, you might have something that you can show that you're learning and pivoting. And then that just gives investors more faith that you're the right founder and the founding team to make this a success, which I'm guessing is the same as kind of with the growth hacking. It's just you as a founder and determination and the.
Or it could be community building. Yes, there's no revenue at all, but you have, a Discord community with over 1,000 people talking about the problem that you want to solve for. It's just showing that you're thinking outside the box and you're engaging with your target users, and you're creating hype, a community, product love, the initial kind of evidence of this, that de-risks the investment.
There's a question that's come in on the chat, and I think it might somewhat relate to what you did in the early stages. So the question is, would it have been possible to raise without a product and based on the idea? And I guess that's like the MVP that you had of the product, which isn't necessarily even a product. So with your kind of Bristol, 2 boroughs, using Facebook groups, where were you actually at in terms of product development when you were doing the fundraise?
Oh, it was horrible. It was a Squarespace. I'm not a coder. It was a Squarespace website. It was really ugly. And it did the bare minimum. And it was like mostly, I was using spreadsheets. The website was just for show. So there was no product, but it still meant that we could facilitate bookings. And it was validating the concept of what it would later be. So our idea was, let's do everything that doesn't scale. Let's map it out and do it very manually, every part of the business, so that we really understand how it works, so that when we go to bring on a tech team, we can break it down and build out each part, test it, iterate and learn as we go. So it was, rather than the people, and another kind of thing that was really important for us is, for my business model, there's been so many failed people in our space. There's a whole graveyard of people that have tried to build a student accommodation and end up giving up. So I went and spoke to so many of the founders that had failed in the space, understand why it had failed and what they'd done, and what they would do differently. And every time I'd hear that they would just spend a year in silo building out the tech product, launching it, then no one, they got it wrong. There was no users after the point of launch. So we did the exact opposite, which was do everything manually, use spreadsheets, really learn, and then gradually include automations to be able to make this whole model more scalable. So yeah, there was no product in the early days. I think you can always hack it somehow, or at least, bring on focus groups, create a community, get buy-in for what you're doing.
Who was in the founding team in the very early days? Was it just you? Did you have other people? And how did you divide who's doing what?
So the first hire we made was a commercial manager. I'm not quite even sure what that meant. I think it meant you were going to do everything. So commercial manager, who now is 3 years later is our head of product. So he was hired, an ex-consultant, joined, was doing everything in the business. And then we brought on 2 tech advisors who had been working for Depop and Tesco for the last 25 years, that just had equity, that built out the foundations of the platform as we migrated off that Squarespace, or we kind of had a back end to what we were doing. And then we made our first tech hire, and then we made our first sales hires to build out the supply of the platform, and then our first marketing hire, and we kind of grew it from there.
Did you think, being a solo founder, that there was any pushback from investors? And just because it came up just before you joined, same with being a female founder, did you feel that that held you back in any way?
I did get a few investors say that they would only invest if I had a co-founder, because what happens if I get hit by a bus? So there's a few people that's part of their criteria. They will only invest in a co-founder pair. And otherwise, so even some investors that did say that to me, I would just show the power of the senior leadership team. So before I raised the seed round, it was really important for me to bring on a COO who had that kind of financial experience, more of a COO/CFO, so that they could see that it wasn't just entirely alone, and that there was that support system around, and it was not just a one-man band. So I think making sure you have a senior leadership in place when you're about to raise the next round with more cash, and that it becomes more important. With the pre-seed, I didn't have too many questions around the senior leadership team and having a co-founder.
What about the female founder? Did you think it made any difference at all?
I think being a female founder, you just have to be aware that everyone says that you need an advisor, and everyone wants to be your advisor. You get a lot of requests of, you can't do this alone, I'll be your advisor, but give me 5% of the business. I think that's something, from speaking to male founders, that's the biggest difference. So just being really careful of who you end up partnering with. You have to view it as a marriage. So being really careful of who you give equity to and what they can add, and making sure it's super transparent in any agreements of what they're promising to give you, in order to actually give them equity, so that you can hold them to account, and you can very quickly exit them from the business if they're unable to add value. So I think that's the key thing to be really aware of. And I think you will be underestimated in a lot of situations, and people will look for the senior leadership team around you. But I think as long as you're passionate about the story, and you show that you're the reason why you're the best person to do this, because they'll ask you those questions, then it's very much that you can use to your advantage.
Again, I don't know if you're able to take yourself off mute or take yourself off, turn the video on, but
yes, I am.
From an investor's perspective, after everything we've asked Hannah, what stood out to you about Hannah or Hybr, or both?
So Hannah, I actually met at Chappatte demo day back in June. At which point, Hannah, correct me if I'm wrong, I think you were at about 1.3 million maybe raised of the 1.5 target. So it took me, this was before we started 2121. So it was really in September when we started 2121. She was actually our first match day. So she was the first company coming to present. So I touched base with her about 3 months after when we first met, and she had added probably at that point another 1.5 million maybe to her initial 1 point, or maybe another million, Hannah, maybe from 1.3 to 2.3 in September. So that obviously is a huge stamp of approval. That means another £1 million had gone in and supported her over the last 3 months. Like she mentioned, setting targets that you can over deliver on very impressive, keeping people updated about what's going on. Her Notion page was amazing. Hannah, I talk about this all the time. I tell founders they should do this starting from their pre-seed round, because it basically gives you an organic 1.5 year history of what she's done with the business, and seeing that development over time, it's really hard to say no to. She's very good with her pitching. Hannah, you can maybe talk a little bit about how you have different decks for investor outreach and your investor meetings. She was just extremely thorough in crossing her T's and dotting her I's. So it really, I mean, a lot of the DD, literally, it's a turnkey solution. She has her data room and her Notion ready to go. It was really a lot of the questions that you could potentially ask as an investor were already answered before you got there. So that's really, made it very easy for us. And it's also a problem that many of us have actually suffered from. I always say, if it makes sense in 20 seconds, it'll make sense in 20 days. And the problem that Hannah is solving is just a problem that I think many people on this call have probably suffered from. I'll stop there.
I just, before we go into a response to that, Hannah, just out of interest, by show of hands, how many people have started preparing a data room for their raise? And if you can just write in the chat, like, is everyone aware of what should be included in a data room? Or should we spend a bit of time going through what would be useful for you to have that you can just send to investors to start doing DD? Whilst we get some responses in the chat, Hannah, maybe you can talk about your data room.
I think that was a really good point, just to mention there around different decks, because I had some really good advisors, one really good advisor that was so brutal when I did the kind of mock pitches with him. And he hated the first few pitches I did because the decks were way too detailed. My storytelling was way too long. And he was just ruthless with, like, what are you trying to communicate? Why would I care? Why should I care? Like, over and over again. And it was really kind of soul destroying, but it was an important part of the process to go through, so that you're really refined and concise with what you're saying, because people don't catch. Every time I pitched, I was really interested to hear that 20% of what I said was really absorbed, even though I was being super concise. So I think just really bringing it down to the bare bones, is so important. So for the seed rounds, we'd have objectives, so kind of OKRs. We'd have the financials, unit economics, cap table if you've already got one, market research, more explanation around the tech or what the tech will look like, use of funds, competitor landscape, team and hiring plan, route to market, investor FAQs. Now that was the most important. So I guess to give you a bit more information around that, the investor FAQs will be like, what is product market fit? How will you hit 100 million revenue? How do you think about your impact? How do you scale one side of the marketplace? What does exclusivity look like? What is the biggest, what's your biggest concern with your business? What's your moat? Blah, blah, blah. So why is now the right time? Like, all the questions that you get all the time, all in one place. So again, you can also perfect those answers, as well as like pitch deck, product roadmap, customer feedback, press, and legals.
Yeah, so hopefully that's helpful to everyone that put in the chat. That would be good to know. Did you start with any template, or did you just start from scratch?
I think that I probably saw templates either on Notion, or my brother is also an entrepreneur, so I think I might have taken inspiration from his and something else online.
I think one of the core things is, so you put your deck in there, information on a cap table, legals, we can find an article that outlines everything that's useful to have. But I think the FAQs is, you need to empathize with an investor, which is what Emma was talking about at the beginning, and think about the questions that they are going to ask you. And then obviously when you're doing your first initial pitches to, like Hannah was saying, the investors that aren't like the hot investors on your list, but ones that you're not so interested in getting a yes from, but it's good to practice on. And then you'll get to understand more of the questions that investors ask. We're doing pitch practice this Friday, so we're going to be asking a bunch of questions. So that's a good place to start with the FAQs as well. Samaya, did you have a question?
Hi. Yeah, I do have a few questions. One of the question is, how do you structure the shares that you give to your investors? Generally, like, how do you know who gets a voting share and who doesn't?
So this is why I think it's so important to firstly make sure that all the investors are on the same terms, and don't overcomplicate it, especially for pre-seed. I didn't spend any time on this. I literally just got the quote from Sea Beagles. I spoke to 3 different law firms, picked the law firm that I thought I'd have the best relationship with, and then got the most basic template of, for a pre-seed round, structured it with ordinary shares for investors, and use that, and just didn't spend any time on this. I put all my time onto the actual raising, and that's why using the best experts for a reason. If you're getting, make sure you have the right accountant, make sure you have the right law firm, and not trying to overly concern yourself with the details, just trying to make the round as simple as possible.
So do people, everybody that you take on board has a voting right?
So we changed the structure for the most recent rounds, but no, the investor majority would have a voting right.
Okay. The other question is, obviously you mentioned that you're a solo founder. So how did you onboard a senior leadership team without or pre-funding, or how did it work?
So before we raised our pre-seed round, we were very small amounts, but we were revenue generating. And also I did a lot of grant pitches. So a lot of pitch competitions to win equity-free money, so grants. And that helped us make our first few hires as well. So because of the kind of more social impact part of our business, that was how we got our first funding on board, which then allowed me to hire talent. And then that allowed us to slightly scale out our impact and then go and raise the pre-seed round.
And how important is it to take on board like an advisor? Because like yourself, I've got many advisors, and I just feel like I'm not prepared to give away equity unless you're bringing value, because advice I can pretty much find anywhere.
So the only people we gave equity to from an advisor perspective before the pre-seed was 2 people. One, the tech advisors who built out the tech platform. So there was something very tangible attached to that equity over a 5-year vesting period, and set them out and help scaling out the tech team. And the second one was Debbie Wasco from Albright Network, who had also exited from a business that was very similar to us. So it was a marketplace model in housing, in real estate. So she had very relevant experience of exited business, and she was part of this big network and had a huge angel investor network to introduce me to. So again, I gave her equity for advisory hours on a monthly basis and introductions. And she actually opened most of the doors for our advisors for our pre-seed, not advisors, for our angel investors from our pre-seed rounds. So 2 advisors that I gave equity to for very specific, tangible outcomes that I could track.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Did you get those advisors to sign an agreement which had those outcomes so that you could measure their success, as it were?
Yeah.
Question. I think this is a question from the chat. I think this is the question that you're asking, Megan. But with the data room, at what point do you share all of that information with the investors? Is it after that first pitch when they've shown interest, or further down the line?
After that first pitch when they showed interest. But I have to say I had a much simpler version for pre-seed. It was really just kind of cool, but still super useful to have. because it just makes you feel really prepared going into those first calls as well, because you know exactly what they're going to ask and you have all the data there. And one question I remember, actually, the first pitch I ever did for our pre-seed round, the pitch that I completely flopped on was the what was it? It's like what went wrong at the beginning of your journey? And I just did not have an answer for it, and it made me look like I hadn't self-reflected at all, and that we'd done everything right when that wasn't the reason. It wasn't the case. But you know, actually making sure you spend time on the Q&A is so important, and prep.
That makes sense. What's any more questions? Do raise your hand. What's next for Hybr? So now that you've raised this recent round, when will you fundraise again? And what does good look like for the money that you do have now?
So we are looking to raise a Series A in 18 months' time, which will give us about 6 months to raise the Series A. And for us, it's really all about really showing product market fit in 3 cities, which means that we can capture material market share, so that the bookings, the student lets, the bookings are coming through Hybr, and that we have a loved product, so that once we are at more, we've kind of scaled out in those 3 locations, we're capturing that market share, proving that we can match supply to demand, that we still have that loved product and that GMV retention, so that our users are coming back to us and continue to use us. And then that we've got that growth playbook that can work in 3 very different cities, in the regional cities, the metropolitan cities, so that you can see that, again, if we can inject more money in, that we can copy and paste that across the UK, potentially into a European kind of city as a trial as well. So for us, it was really important exercise to look at and speak to Series A investors to say, what are you looking for? What does good look like? And then working backwards.
Yeah. And are you building relationships with those investors now? And kind of similarly with this group, do you think they should be building relationships with seed investors before they've got to pre-seed?
I think yes, and I mean no, in terms of don't do anything that's going to be a distraction. And I think like at the moment right now, we're just entirely focused on product market fit. So at least for the first half of this year, I'm not going to be speaking to Series A investors. The second half of the year, that's when I'll start having those conversations where I'm happy with where we're at. And then we'll start, you know, validating that we're working to the right metrics and we're really getting that buy-in and people can start tracking our journey. But it's just so important to focus and not try and do too many things at once, which is always the most difficult thing.
Question from the chat from Margaret. What advice do you have for founders building marketplace businesses? Kind of how did you deal with the supply and demand chicken and egg problem?
So for us, it's about tracking, I mean, because exactly as you just said, like one quarter will be supply constrained, another quarter will be demand constrained. And so it's just about making sure we have real visibility over what is causing the biggest bottleneck right now. Is it on the supply side or the demand side, or actually are they interlinked? For example, for us, it's all about not just showing that we can onboard supply, but that supply is engaged and responsive, so that if we get demand, we're able to facilitate a booking quickly. So it's all about kind of the time to inquiry to ensure engagement, the onboarding experience, and facilitating kind of fast let. So it's really about breaking down those metrics and being obsessed with that customer funnel. So you can see if there's a leaky bucket, you can see where the problem areas are. And I think the biggest learning for me personally this year has been putting resources together so that you're problem solving all together as a company on one key issue a quarter, rather than last year when we were trying to do way too much every quarter and, you know, everyone's working on their own projects.
Yeah. So Maya, I don't know if you just lowered your hand and raised it because you had more questions. So if you do, feel free to ask.
I do. I wanted to ask, what were the different kinds of pitch decks that she had? Because I know she mentioned that she's had different pitch decks to send to different kinds of investors.
So we had a pitch deck that was more tailored to an angel investor and more tailored towards a VC. And we had a pitch deck that was the one that we send, which is more detailed because you don't know anything. I haven't spoken to you. You don't know anything about the story, and a pitch deck that I pitched with and presented so that you were focusing on what I'm saying rather than trying to read heavy slides.
And what's the difference between the deck that you sent out to VCs as opposed to angels?
The VC deck was be more focused on the kind of scalability questions. You know, what is the big vision? How are we going to get to, you know, the £1 billion valuation? It's like thinking as big as you can on that 5-year plan. Whereas the angel investors, like, how are we going to make sure that this is a profitable model, and what does the next 2 years really look like? So it's different scales. It's not that they're not both true, but it's looking at it from a different perspective. What is the grand vision here about how you're going to take over the world? And, you know, what are you going to do to ensure that the next 2 years are going to be de-risked, and that you have a really concrete plan in place and you've already validated everything that you're going to be doing.
Okay. And how important is it to break it down to TAM, SAM, and SOM, or just giving the market sizing and saying this is the size of the total addressable market?
So we just did, you know, this is the size of the market. We basically did break that down into this is what we think we can achieve. Not on too much detail, but I think what was really helpful in our last round is that we showed, okay, this is what we've already done in this small borough in this city. Now let's times that by 30, by how many different cities we want to go into, different boroughs, and now look what we can achieve. So this is really what we've already done versus what we can do if we copy and paste that across 30 different locations. So again, making it really tangible and clear on not just if throwing these huge, you know, market, £52 million GMV spent in the market on the annual basis, you know, huge number, great. But actually breaking that down, like, if we're going to target 3% of that in the next 5 years, what does that look like, and how do you get there?
Just to jump in.
And how? Sorry,
I was just
one
going
more.
to say,
How? Yeah, go ahead.
just for anyone that that doesn't know about TAM, SAM, and SOM, we're going to go over that in the 11 slides you need in your pitch deck tomorrow. So we'll let you know what the difference are between the three and how to calculate them. Samaya, go ahead.
My next question was a follow on from that. Like, how did you, at pre-seed, how did you identify what the obtainable market was?
So for us, it's looking at pre-seed, it was looking just at the student accommodation market. So there's £13 million is spent on rent on an annual basis in the student market. So that is the addressable market. We're just looking at student accommodation. And if we charge landlords, if we have a take rate of 3% of the annual rent, then this is what we can achieve. If we would have 100% of the market, if we had 50% of the market, we had 10% of the market, 3% of the market. So that's kind of how we looked at it. It's like, what is being spent in your industry on an annual basis? What percentage do you think you can target over what time period, and how are you going to do that?
Okay, and this might be a fairly basic question, but I'm a little confused. So if your addressable market is, say, 13 million, which is how much money is being spent in the student accommodation, obviously the obtainable market for you is just a service fee of whatever that is, say 1%, 1.3 million. So is your TAM 13 million or 1.3 million?
So the best way to break that down is, we would say, okay, there's this amount. So the market's worth 52 million in the under 30s rental market. Let me see if I can share my screen actually show something. Do I have it here? If I said the market's worth 52 million, then we would want to target 3% of that market, then we have X amount of revenue that we can target on Hybr, and then we can break down what that means in terms of the GMV. So on an annual, what we track on a weekly, monthly basis is what commission are we taking? So what's our revenue, and what's the total GMV that we're making for our customer? For a really important marketplace metric is, what is the total GMV that we're generating? What is the value that we're generating for our clients? So a lot of investors are just entirely focused on that. They don't care about what cut we're taking, because we can obviously increase that as we increase our value of our product. But instead, they just care about what value are we creating for the clients that use Hybr. So if a landlord is renting out their whole portfolio through Hybr, what is the total amount of revenue that we're generating for them for the 12-month contract that we give them? And then you can see the total value, and that's actually more important, because we charge 3% today. So what we can charge 5% in 3 years' time. So it's really more about looking at the total amount of value that your product gives to your audience, And then you can break that down into the commission that you charge today versus the commission you can charge in 3 years' time.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Yeah. Thank you.
From a the pre-seed fundraise, how long did it actually take you from kind of first day or pitch one to closing the whole of the pre-seed round?
Pre-seed, I'd say it probably took, I think I set out to start the pitching in November. So obviously did the kind of deck prep in October, started pitching in November, and we did a first close. And actually, this is an important note we've done every time. We always do like a first close and make sure we're actually bringing the money in as we go in February. And then we did a top-up round in June, because then that happened again for our seed round. Is you start creating a lot of momentum, you're speaking to a lot of different investors, you put pressure on so you can actually close the money, otherwise the process gets drawn out and people lose interest. But then there will always be people that actually miss out and you do want on board, so then we would always open up and do a top-up round to get the final amount of money in.
And was that kind of how long you were anticipating it to take, or did it take slightly longer than you were expecting?
I think that I had already unrealistic target of 3 months, which was, I was doing about 4 pitches a day to try and meet that target of 3 months, but I really didn't want it to take up too much of my time. So in both the pre-seed and the seed round, I've said to myself, I'm going to do like 2 months to 3 months of intense pitching, and the rest of the time we'll just be closing up the round.
Yeah. Engin,
How did your deck evolve as you were pitching during those 2-3 months? Was it static or was it dynamic throughout?
Very much dynamic throughout, responding to feedback. So it'd be really interesting to hear how people respond to the deck, the questions that they ask, and if there's some really particular questions every time that you haven't communicated that well enough. So making sure that you are going back, is a great question, and editing, including parts of the story that clearly are not clear enough.
yeah. And you weren't doing like agile fundraising, so you didn't have a seed fast come in for 20 grand that then you could spend right away as you were kind of building momentum for the rest of the raise.
We were collecting cash and as we went. So yeah, we were.
Okay. Because that's a good strategy for founders that are completely bootstrapped right now. It's not that you have to say, I'm going to raise 150 grand and you have to wait until all of that 150 grand has come in to be able to use it. If you get a 10K ticket from someone, you can ask them to sign a seed fast or equivalent, and then get the money in quicker. So if you want to spend some money on product development or go to market, you can do so whilst you're still raising from other investors.
Yeah, super important.
Any last questions? We've got 4 minutes left. If there's anything you would like to ask Hannah about her fundraise, marketplace, go to market, anything like that.
Can I ask one more? Pretty,
Yes.
Can I ask one more?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Hannah, did you use advanced subscription agreements, ASAs, as a form of agile financing, or to get people in the door early so you can market that through the later end of the round?
Yes, exactly. So the former, we used an ASA so that we could make sure that we were collecting the capital to grow the business during the round. I think that's a really important point of every time making sure that you're going out to raise in your best cycle. So if you have a cyclical nature of the business, if there is a point where you're going to be able to bring on a lot of users, or you're about to kick off lots of different campaigns, because when you're doing the follow-ups after your first pitches and you're keeping people in the loop, it's great to say, we just had our best day of bookings or user signups or whatever that metric is for you, so that you can create momentum and then you use that as a way to kind of continue that conversation until you get the signatures.
Question that's just come in from the chat. So quick one. Can you recommend that law firm, or what was the name of the law firm that you were using that you'd recommend?
Just added it to the chat.
Awesome.
I did a direct message by some, yeah.
And then question from Timo. How did you determine your marketing spend? He's added a bit of context. In the student letting market, there has to be quite an important split between enticing the landlords as well as the students. How did you spend on both groups?
So it was really important within our pre-seed round. One of our big metrics or points of celebration was to say we've achieved a lot with little to no spend. So it was very much around how we could hack it with spending, because we were bootstrapped as well, so we didn't have any money to spend. So it was, how can we show that we can build momentum by spending nothing? So in pre-seed, we weren't doing ads, we were getting a stamp of approval from, and this is actually another good point to mention, if you can get any buy-in from a big brand, even if it's just a stamp of approval, some sort of collaboration, it is really important to show trust and again, buy-in from the rest of the market. So for us, it was building a relationship with the University of Bristol, and maybe we put a tiny bit of marketing budget towards going to one of their housing fairs or speaking in an event. But we spent very little, and we on purpose to show that we could build momentum by spending little. So now if you can give us money, then this is how much further we can grow. This is how we can accelerate growth.
Yeah, and when you have on your deck how much you're raising and what that money is going to, investors don't like it if you put a ton of money on ads and you have no proof as to whether that ad spend is going to pay off. So you don't want to spend all of your money on advertising, not knowing whether advertising is going to work. So anything that you can do that doesn't cost a ton of money, firstly, like building community or associating yourself with a big brand, just gives the investor more faith that you've figured out a go-to-market strategy that's going to work for you.
Yeah, we invested in our ambassador community in those earlier days. So we had students who were bought into our product, who were really excited by what we could be doing. And we invested in creating that community rather than, exactly as you said, spending on ads.
And we're just out of time. Engin, do you want to ask your final question or make your final
one last? How do you balance taking money from, let's say, real estate industry active investors or landlords without making it look like you're very closely aligned with them, so you don't turn off the other landlords? I think this could be a very important strategic investor question.
So we, instead of going for targeting kind of specific users, I mean, there's different ways to approach this. What we did instead is targeting people who are well known within our industry. So a big names, for example, the CEOs of the office group. They were in commercial real estate, so there was no kind of questions around, too much crossover, loyalty issues. But they were very well known within residential real estate. So they had a large network that they could connect us to. So those were the kind of perfect people for us to target within our pre-seed. But I do think that it isn't a bad thing to get buy-in from your early adopters and getting them to invest small amount of money, because they're going to shape the product, and be able to have people who are really bought in, super engaged, can give you direct feedback for all your product launches is so useful. Having some sort of customer advisory board in the early days of those kind of super fan users that will shape the product and give live feedback is really important, and allowing them to invest a smaller amount so that they can have that buy-in and want to continue using you and want to help you grow is so important.
Thank you so much, Hannah, for all of that useful feedback and sharing your story and being so open. We'll stop recording and let you go. If anybody wants to connect with you, what's the best way for them to do so?
LinkedIn, Hannah Chappatte. Yes, I think that's the best way. But no, thanks so much for having me. I hope it was useful.
Take care. Bye-bye. We'll stick around. I'm just going to stop